Picture this: a wall of dirt 10,000 feet high racing towards you at 60 mph, turning day into night instantly. Most people would panic. Native Americans had somehow prepared for this exact moment. They had a secret that made these killer storms completely harmless. How did they do it? Long before meteorologists existed with their fancy equipment, Native American scouts had already mastered the art of reading nature's warning signs. These weren't weekend weather enthusiasts checking apps on their phones. These were survival experts whose lives depended on getting it right every single time. The sky told stories if you knew how to listen. Scouts would climb to high vantage points, scanning the horizon for that telltale brown haze creeping across the landscape like spilled coffee on a tablecloth. But here's what most people don't realize. The really skilled observers weren't just looking up. They were watching everything around them. Birds became nature's early warning system. Hawks that normally soared in lazy circles would suddenly dart for cover. Smaller songbirds got jumpy, flitting nervously between branches like they couldn't sit still. Even stranger, insects would disappear completely, vanishing into whatever tiny hiding spots they could find. Makes sense when you think about it. Getting caught in a dust storm when you weigh less than a paperclip isn't exactly a survival strategy. Then there were the four-legged forecasters. Horses would pace restlessly, tossing their heads and snorting at the wind. Dogs became anxious, whining and seeking shelter even when the sky still looked clear. Cattle bunched together, turning their backs to a wind that hadn't arrived yet. These animals weren't being dramatic. They were responding to pressure changes and electrical shifts that human senses couldn't detect. The most experienced scouts developed an almost supernatural ability to read atmospheric pressure. They'd feel it in their bones before seeing any visual signs. A sudden shift in wind direction, especially when it came from an unusual angle, meant trouble was brewing. Temperature drops that seemed to come out of nowhere were another red flag. Well, more like a red tornado warning, but reading the signs was only half the battle. The other half was communication speed that would make modern social media jealous. News traveled through native communities faster than you'd think possible. Smoke signals, relay runners, and strategic positioning meant that one scout's observation could reach dozens of families within hours. No cell towers required. The really smart tribes had established networks spanning vast territories. One group might spot storm signs 50 miles away and pass the message along a chain of communities. By the time the dust wall actually arrived, families had already secured their belongings, moved livestock to safety, and prepared their shelters for the onslaught. What made this system work wasn't just individual skill, it was collective wisdom passed down through generations. Elders taught younger scouts not just what to look for, but how to prioritize threats and make split-second decisions that could save lives. Of course, spotting an incoming dust storm was just the beginning. Once those warning signs appeared, families had to move fast to find the safest possible hiding places before nature unleashed its fury. Spotting a dust storm from miles away was just the first step. Now came the real challenge, finding somewhere safe to ride it out. Native American tribes had figured out through generations of trial and error that not all hiding spots were created equal. Caves were absolute gold. Well, more like dusty gold, but you get the idea. A deep cave or rock overhang could completely shield families from the worst winds. The deeper, the better. Some tribes would scout out cave systems during calm weather, marking the best ones and even stashing emergency supplies inside. Smart move, considering these storms could last for days. But here's where it gets interesting. Not everyone lived near convenient caves, so they got creative. Dugout homes became the next best thing. These weren't your typical above-ground houses. Families would dig partway into hillsides or create homes that sat mostly below ground level. The earth itself became their shield. Dust storms that could strip paint off rocks would just whoosh right over these underground sanctuaries. Then there's the forest trick. Dense woodland areas created natural windbreaks that could tame even the fiercest storms. Trees acted like nature's own dust filters, catching the worst debris before it reached the people sheltering beneath. Pine forests worked especially well because those thick needles grabbed dust particles like tiny green magnets. Geography played favorites too. Big rock formations and hills could split powerful winds, creating calmer pockets of air on the protected side. Tribes learned to read the landscape like a survival manual. That massive boulder over there? Perfect windbreak. The valley between those two ridges? Storm highway. Avoid at all costs. Livestock needed protection just as much as people did. Animals left in open areas during dust storms could actually suffocate from breathing too much dirt. Experienced families would move their horses, dogs, and other animals to sheltered valleys or natural depressions in the land before storms hit. Animals have decent survival instincts, but a wall of dust moving at 30 miles per hour doesn't leave much time for decision-making. The weird part is how some locations that looked perfect turned out to be disaster zones. Open plains that seemed harmless on calm days became death traps during storms. The flat ground gave dust clouds nothing to slow them down. What started as a manageable dust devil could build into a monster storm with nothing in its way. Some families even created backup plans for their backup plans. Primary shelter in the cave, secondary spot in the dugout, emergency location in the dense forest grove. Because weather doesn't always cooperate with your schedule, and storms sometimes change direction without warning. Finding the right hideout was crucial, but having a good shelter meant nothing if it couldn't actually withstand the pounding winds and flying debris headed your way. Finding shelter was just the beginning. Native Americans knew that even the best natural hideout wouldn't survive a dust storm without serious upgrades. The difference between life and death often came down to how well they could fortify their temporary homes against nature's fury. Sod became their secret weapon. These thick, grass-covered chunks of earth stacked like nature's own building blocks, creating walls that could laugh at howling winds. Clay mixed with water formed a paste that sealed every crack and gap between stones or wooden posts. Makes sense, right? When dust particles are trying to invade every tiny opening, you need walls that are basically bulletproof against dirt. But here's where it gets clever. The roofs weren't just slapped together with whatever was lying around. Animal hides got stretched tight and layered like shingles, with each piece overlapping the one below it. Bark from birch trees peeled off in large sheets that worked like natural tiles. Woven grass mats, tightly bound and thick as your thumb, created another barrier that dust couldn't penetrate easily. Then there's the genius of small windows and tight-fitting doors. While modern folks might want big-picture windows, Native Americans knew that every opening was an invitation for dust to throw a party inside their shelter. They carved out tiny window spaces just big enough to peek through, then covered them with thin animal membranes that let in light but kept out the grit. The weird part is how they handled the inside walls. Special blankets made from tightly woven fibers got hung along interior surfaces, creating a second skin for the entire shelter. These weren't just for decoration or warmth. They caught dust that managed to sneak through the outer defenses, preventing it from swirling around and making breathing impossible. Let's not forget the constant maintenance cycle. Every single storm taught them something new about their shelter's weak spots. A loose corner here, a gap there, or maybe the wind found a way to lift part of the roof. Repairs happened immediately after each storm passed, not weeks later when they remembered to fix things. Well, the really smart part was how they reinforced corners and joints. These spots took the worst beating from wind, so extra clay, additional stones, or strips of hide got wrapped around connection points like natural duct tape. Nothing fancy, just practical solutions that worked when the stakes were literally survival. The whole process turned temporary shelters into fortress-like structures that could handle multiple storms throughout a season. Each improvement made the next storm a little less terrifying, a little more manageable. But even the strongest shelter was useless if the people inside couldn't breathe properly or protect themselves from the dust that inevitably found its way in. That's where the right clothing and personal protection became absolutely critical for staying alive. When dust storms turned the world into a swirling nightmare, your clothes became your armor. Native American communities knew that surviving these brutal conditions meant dressing smart, not just dressing warm. Multiple layers of tightly woven cloth created the first line of defense against flying grit. But here's what most people don't realize. It wasn't just about piling on random fabric. The inner layer needed to be soft against skin, while outer layers had to be tough enough to handle sand moving at incredible speeds. Think of it like building a shield that you could actually wear. The real game changer? Wet cloths wrapped around faces and noses. Sounds simple, right? Well, this wasn't just about comfort. Moisture caught dust particles before they reached the lungs, preventing what we now call respiratory distress. Parents taught children to breathe slowly through these makeshift masks, turning survival into a learned skill. Animal hides served as the ultimate protective gear, especially for the most vulnerable family members. Elders and young children got priority access to the thickest, most durable leather garments. These weren't fashionable by any stretch, but they worked like medieval armor against nature's assault. Then there's the footwear situation. Regular shoes? Completely useless. Moccasins, however, were engineered for exactly these conditions. The flexible leather-protected feet from scorching sand while allowing enough mobility to move quickly when storms shifted direction. Some communities even double-layered their moccasins with extra padding during particularly harsh seasons, but the most ingenious invention had to be the specialized storm hats. These weren't your typical headwear. They featured extended flaps that covered ears, necks, and even parts of the face. Makes sense when you realize that exposed skin could get sandblasted raw in minutes. The weird part is how effective these simple modifications were compared to modern gear. Different tribes developed their own clothing innovations based on local materials. Prairie communities relied heavily on tightly woven grasses incorporated into fabric, while desert groups perfected techniques using specific animal furs that naturally repelled fine particles. Women often spent entire seasons preparing storm clothing for their families, understanding that proper gear could mean the difference between minor discomfort and serious injury. They'd test fabric density by throwing handfuls of sand at samples, keeping only materials that provided complete protection. Children learned early that storm clothes weren't optional. Families developed systems where everyone had designated gear stored in easily accessible spots. When scout warnings came in about approaching storms, people could dress appropriately within minutes. The clothing strategies worked so well that some techniques influenced how these communities dressed year-round, incorporating storm-ready elements into everyday garments. Smart thinking when you never knew when the next dust wall might appear on the horizon. Of course, having the right clothes was just the beginning. Even the best protective gear meant nothing if you didn't have clean water and safe food waiting inside your shelter. Your fancy modern pantry with its airtight containers. Well, Native Americans figured out that trick centuries before Tupperware was even a dream. They knew something we're still learning today. Dust gets into everything unless you're really, really smart about storage. Clay pots became the original food savers. These weren't just any pots either. Families crafted them with tight-fitting lids that sealed so well, not even the finest dust particles could sneak inside. Makes sense, right? The clay kept temperature stable while the tight seal kept the grit out. Seeds, dried corn, beans, and nuts stayed fresh for months this way. But here's where it gets clever. Underground storage. Native Americans dug special pits lined with bark or animal hides, creating natural refrigerators that dust storms couldn't touch. These underground caches stayed cool in summer and didn't freeze solid in winter. Pretty genius for people who supposedly didn't have technology. Water presented its own challenges during dust storms. You can't exactly seal water in clay pots for weeks without problems, so families got creative. They covered water containers with multiple layers of tightly woven cloth, then placed flat stones on top for extra weight. This kept flying debris from contaminating their precious water supply. Then there's the filtering system they developed. Sand and charcoal became nature's water purifiers. When dust inevitably mixed with drinking water, they'd pour it through layers of clean sand, then through crushed charcoal made from specific types of wood. The result? Water cleaner than what many people had access to just 100 years ago. The weird part is how they rationed food during long storms. Families didn't just guess how much they'd need, they had systems. Elders tracked storm patterns and knew whether a particular dust storm might last 2 days or 2 weeks. They'd distribute food accordingly, making sure the youngest and oldest ate first, while healthy adults made do with less. Storage locations mattered too. Smart families never kept all their food in one place. They'd hide multiple caches around their territory, kind of like having several bank accounts. If one storage spot got discovered by animals or damaged by storms, they had backups ready. Emergency foods included pemmican, a mixture of dried meat, fat, and berries that could last for months without spoiling. This stuff packed serious nutrition in small portions, perfect for riding out extended storms when hunting became impossible. What's really impressive is how they prevented spoilage without refrigeration. Certain herbs and plants acted as natural preservatives, keeping stored foods fresh longer than you'd expect. They understood which plants fought off insects and mold, knowledge that took food scientists decades to rediscover. But knowing how to store food safely was just one piece of survival. Staying healthy during these brutal storms required completely different skills that could mean the difference between life and death. When dust storms hit, staying alive meant more than just finding shelter. Your lungs could fill with dirt, your eyes could get scratched raw, and breathing became a real challenge. Native American families knew exactly what to do when the air turned dangerous. The smart move? Chew on certain roots and herbs that helped fight what we'd call dust pneumonia today. Elders passed down knowledge about which plants cleared your throat and eased breathing troubles. Wild cherry bark worked wonders for coughs. Slippery elm made scratchy throats feel better fast. And the weird part is, many of these natural remedies actually worked better than you'd expect. Children learned early that storms meant staying inside. Period. No arguments, no exceptions. Parents didn't mess around when it came to dust sickness. Kids who breathed too much grit could develop serious lung problems that lasted for weeks. Makes sense, right? Even adults struggled with the thick, choking air during bad storms. Then there's the clever trick with wet cloths everywhere. Families soaked blankets and draped them over beds, cribs, and sleeping areas. The moisture in the fabric helped trap dust particles before they reached people's faces. Mothers would dampen rags and tie them around everyone's nose and mouth, creating makeshift filters that actually saved lives. But here's where experience really mattered. Older family members became like medical detectives, watching for early signs of dust pneumonia in relatives. They'd check for persistent coughing, chest pain, or trouble breathing that got worse instead of better. Catching these symptoms early meant the difference between a quick recovery and serious illness. Let's not forget the mental health side of survival. Being trapped inside during howling dust storms could drive people crazy with worry and fear. Families developed ways to stay calm and positive when the world outside turned hostile. Storytelling became medicine for anxious minds. Elders shared old tales that transported everyone away from the scary reality outside their walls. Songs helped too. Singing together made breathing easier and kept spirits up during the longest, most frightening storms. The rhythm of familiar melodies calmed nerves and gave families something to focus on besides the wind screaming overhead. Well, the really smart families also created special breathing spaces inside their shelters. They'd hang extra wet blankets in corners, making little clean air pockets where the most vulnerable family members could rest. Pregnant women, tiny babies, and elderly relatives got priority access to these protected zones. When someone did get sick from dust exposure, the whole family pitched in with care. Herbal teas, steam treatments using heated water and medicinal plants, and constant attention helped patients recover faster. Nobody faced dust sickness alone. The health knowledge these families developed during storms would prove just as valuable afterward when the real work of rebuilding began. When the howling winds finally died down and the last grains of dust settled, Native American families didn't just sit around waiting for magic to happen. The real work began immediately. Every surface inside their homes looked like someone had dumped half the prairie through their front door. Sweeping became a daily ritual that would make modern cleaning enthusiasts weep with envy. Women and children used handmade brooms crafted from bundled grass or small branches to push mountains of dust outside. But here's the thing. They couldn't just sweep once and call it good. The fine particles kept floating back down from roof beams and wall cracks for days. Smart families developed a rhythm. Sweep in the morning, again at midday, and once more before sunset. Then there's the matter of structural damage that needed immediate attention. Roofs took the worst beating during these storms. Bark shingles got ripped off, animal hide coverings developed tears, and woven grass sections simply disintegrated under the relentless assault. Men climbed up with fresh materials, often still coughing dust from their lungs while patching holes. The weird part is how they'd sometimes find completely random objects blown onto their roofs. Branches from trees dozens of miles away, pieces of other people's shelters, even small animal bones. Let's not forget the livestock situation, which often bordered on desperate. Horses, cattle, and other animals emerged from storms looking like walking dust sculptures. Their eyes were crusted shut, their nostrils packed with grit, and many showed signs of serious respiratory distress. Families spent hours gently cleaning animals with precious clean water, clearing breathing passages, and providing the freshest available feed. Animals that couldn't recover quickly enough sometimes didn't make it through the following weeks. Food storage inspection turned into a grim treasure hunt through family supplies. Even the most carefully sealed clay pots somehow managed to collect dust around their edges. Families had to dump contaminated grain, throw out spoiled dried meat, and start rationing whatever remained edible. The frustrating part? Sometimes storms hit right before harvest season, destroying months of careful preparation in a matter of hours. But here's where Native American communities really shined. Their incredible support networks kicked into high gear. Neighbors showed up without being asked, bringing extra materials, sharing food, and offering labor for major repairs. Families with intact roofs hosted those whose shelters got destroyed. Kids helped elderly community members clean their homes while adults focused on the heaviest reconstruction work. The most resourceful families always seemed to bounce back fastest, but everyone understood that surviving dust storms was a community effort, not an individual battle. Their remarkable ability to rebuild and adapt after each storm created a foundation of resilience that would serve them well through countless future challenges on the ever-changing Great Plains.